everyone, welcome to the next part of my in-depth series on how to play Warhammer 40K 7th edition. As always, my name is Jay, and today I will be covering the reserve phase. But before we begin on the reserve phase, let's just go do a quick review over all the phases of a normal turn of Warhammer 40K 7th edition. The first phase is the reserve phase in most turns, usually turns 2, 3, and 4. The second phase is the movement phase, in which all the models that you want can move around and get in better position to shoot, or to assault, or to do psychic powers. The next phase, the psychic phase. Now this is one of the cool new phases of 7th edition 40K, where a lot of fun gets to happen and all the psychic powers are cast. The next phase, shooting phase, where you get to shoot at your opponent and kill them. Fun! And the final phase is the assault phase, where all the close combat action happens and they slaughter each other in close combat, and then after that, turn's over. So that's pretty much the phase in itself. So now that we've covered the phases, let's start with the reserve phase. Now why am I specifically starting with this phase, this video? It's because it is the first phase of most turns of 40K, and it is very important, seeing as it gets the guys that are in reserve already onto the table. Now, at this point, you should already be familiar with how to put your guys in reserve. That was covered in the previous video. So essentially, some guys are going to be starting off the table if you want in the game of 40K. And so the reserve phase, what it basically allows you to do is bring those people, or those models, on to the table. Yeah. And as I mentioned before, most armies have access to their reserves turn 2 onward, but there are some armies, such as Space Marines with their drop pods, in which half of them have to come on turn 1 from reserve. Dark Angels, which can choose to come on turn 1 from reserve automatically, or Grey Knights, which can roll to see if they can come on turn 1. So they have access to the reserves actually turn 1. So that's why I'm starting with this video now, seeing as some armies have access to the reserves turn 1, I figured it's a place to start. Plus it is the first phase of the game turn. So now that we know when they can come on, usually turn 2 onwards, some armies have access turn 1. Now it should cover how do you bring on your models from reserve. So what you typically do is, starting turn 2 with most armies with their reserves, is you roll a dice, a d6 for each squad or separate model if they're separate, or vehicle that's in reserve, and on a 1 or 2 they stay in reserve, and you have the ability to try to bring them on again next turn. And on a 3 up, so 3, 4, 5, or 6, that model comes in from reserve that turn. Some armies have the ability to modify these numbers, plus or minus 1, and they can, make a 2 to become a 3, so they come on, or a 3, a 2, so they don't come on. But I'm not going to cover that in too much detail. Just it's in the special rules of your particular codex. Now, turn 2, they have to come on a 3 plus, so 3, 4, 5, or 6. On turn 3, the same thing applies. So on 3, 4, 5, or 6, they come on a 1 or 2, they do not. However, any reserves currently off the table on turn 4 automatically come on turn 4. So if you are just rolling unluckily and you roll a 1 or 2 turn 2, a 1 or 2 turn 3, they automatically come on turn 4. So now we've covered what dice they need to come on. There's 3 different ways in which a model in reserve can potentially come onto the battlefield from reserves. The first one, which is the most basic and the easiest one to do, is just straight off movement into your deployment zone. So they can walk off the table edge and go into your deployment zone from reserves. It's pretty straightforward. Any model that's in reserves can basically do that. And what this means is that a model coming in from reserve just makes a normal movement off the table edge. And what table edge is important? So if you're playing Dawn of War or Vanguard Strike, it is going to be your long table edge. And if you're playing Hammer and Anvil, it's going to be your short table edge. That way it shows, which, basically your deployment zone. And they can come in at any point along that specific table edge and just make a normal movement onto the table. And I must reiterate, no model that comes in from reserve can assault the turn that they come in. That being said. The second way, now this is probably the most common method of coming onto the table, is deep striking. And what deep striking basically allows you to do is fall from the sky anywhere you want onto the table. You have to have a model with the deep strike special rule, or be in a vehicle that has the deep strike special rule in order to deep strike. So the most common one is the drop pod, Most armies have access to drop pods, or most Space Marine armies have access to drop pods, I should specify. And they can just fall from the sky and land anywhere they want on the table. And drop pods, as I said, have a special rule in which they have to, half of them have to come in turn 1, and the rest of them have to be in reserve. So it's a very interesting special rule. And this is specific to drop pods from the Space Marines army. So you can either deep strike a vehicle, or a monstrous creature, a specific character, or you can deep strike a squad. So let's go over the first part, deep striking a single model. So this could be a vehicle in which people are in, like a drop pod, or a monstrous creature, or just an independent character. So we'll use a Dread Knight as this example. So when deep striking a single model, you simply place the model where you want it to go on the battlefield, and then you roll a scatter dice and 2d6. And what a scatter dice is, it's a 6-sided dice with 2 bullseyes and 4 arrows. So what you do is you roll the scatter dice and 2d6, and if you roll a bullseye, it doesn't matter what the other dice are, you don't add them together or anything, the model lands exactly where you want it to land. But if you roll an arrow, you take the other 2 dice and you add them together, and then you move the model in the direction of the arrow, the amount equal to both the dice combined. So for example, if we put this Dread Knight on the table right here, and we roll a bullseye, the Dread Knight actually lands exactly where we want it to land. But if the Dread Knight scatters, like in this example, we add the dice together, equaling 7 inches, and we move the Dread Knight in the direction that the arrow is pointing, and that's ultimately where the Dread Knight lands. And the same thing goes if you're going to be deep striking in a squad. Except what you do is you choose the center person. So you choose a member of the squad and they become your center person for the deep strike. And what you do is you place the center person anywhere you want on the battlefield that you want them to land. And then once again you roll your scatter dice and 2d6. And after determining where the model lands, if it's a bullseye, they land exactly where you want, and if it's an arrow, you move accordingly. And after landing the center person, then you wrap the other members around the squad in base contact around that center person. So they end up being in a circle. After you've completely fulfilled one loop around the center guy, then you can complete a second loop around that first loop. And you go in accordingly and so forth until all the members of the squad are placed on the table in concentric circles. However, there is a situation in which if you scatter or you can't place all the models on the battlefield, it's what's called a deep strike mishap. Now I should mention that there's 3 different ways of having a deep strike mishap. Number 1, deep striking off the battlefield. So if you place your guys on the battlefield, but then they scatter and go off the battlefield and off the table, that is a deep strike mishap. Number 2, landing on impassable terrain. So if you land on this giant rock, you can't place the models because they are on top of a giant rock and they can't be placed. So that is a deep strike mishap. The third one is landing on your or your opponent's models. You have to be able to be placed so you're at least 1 inch away from the closest models, whether it be your opponent or your own models. So if you cannot be placed within those parameters, you are mishapping as well. Now it should be worth mentioning that some vehicles like drop pods have the ability to minimize your distance of scatter so that you don't land on your opponent's models or your own models, so it's harder to mishap with drop pods, but they can still go off the table. And if you mishap, you roll 1d6 and apply that result to the deep strike mishap table. So on a 1, if you roll a 1 on that table, that model and anything that's inside the model is destroyed, removed from play for the rest of the game. They're just gone, dead, kaputs, gone. So if you have a drop pod full of Space Marines and it goes off the table, you mishap, you roll a 1, that drop pod and all the contents are dead and removed from play. It's pretty brutal. Now on a 2 or 3, your opponent can then take that squad or the model and put them anywhere on the battlefield that they wish. So if you want them to land in your opponent's deployment zone and you roll a 2 or 3, your opponent can literally just pick up that drop pod or that model and move it back into your deployment zone, and now your guys are really out of position. And finally, 4, 5, or 6, The models just simply go back into reserve, but it's what's called ongoing reserves. And what the difference between ongoing reserves and normal reserves is, ongoing reserves automatically come on the following game turn. So if you mishap and you roll a 4, 5, or 6, they just go back in reserves, but they automatically come on the following turn, and you can retry to deep strike them once again, and hopefully this time you don't mishap or you don't scatter and they land exactly where you want them to land. And that's pretty much deep striking in a nutshell. So just to sum up deep striking, you place the model or the central model of the squad wherever you want on the battlefield that you want them to land. You roll a scatter dice, and on a bullseye, they land exactly where you want. On a scatter, which is any arrow, you add the other 2 dice up, and you add them together, and it moves in that direction, that distance. If you mishap, which could include landing on your opponent, landing on your own models, landing on impassable terrain, or landing off the table, you roll on the mishap table, and then you roll, you see accordingly. Pretty much straightforward. Also, it should be worth mentioning that if you land on terrain, like if you land inside these ruins, you must take a dangerous terrain check. And what that means is, if you land inside this terrain, any models inside the terrain have to roll. You roll for each model, and on a 1, they take a wound, but normal armor saves apply. So if they have a 2 up armor save in the case of these Deathwing, and they land inside the terrain, on a 1, they take a wound, but on a 2 up, they're okay. On a 1, they die. Pretty straightforward stuff. And that's deep striking in a nutshell. So the final way of coming onto the table, now this isn't very common because most models don't have the special rule, is called outflanking. Now to have outflank, you have to have a model which has the outflank special rule, and they'll be coming in from reserves if you want them to. And what outflank allows you to do is come in from the sides. So rather come in from your deployment zone or come in from the sky, you can come in from the sides of the table. So if you're playing Vanguard Strike or Dawn of War, they come in from the short table edge, from the sides. And if you're playing Hammer and Anvil, they come in from the long table edge, any point along the long table edge. So this can greatly reduce the distance between your models and your opponent's models if positioned correctly. So what you typically do for outflanking models is, once again, you roll at the beginning of the phase, see if they come in. On a 3 up, turn 2 or 3, they come in. They automatically come in turn 4. And so forth, and 5 and after that. And what you do is, you roll 1 dice, a d6. And on a 1 or 2, the models come in on the controlling player's left side edge. So if we're playing Dawn of War, and I roll a 1 or 2, they come in along the left side, so my left side, short table edge, like here. However, on a 3 or 4, they come in on the controlling player's right side table edge. So in this case, if I roll a 3 or 4, they come in along this side's table edge, my short side on the right. And on a 5 or 6, the controlling player gets to decide which table edge they come on. So they can choose the one that's better suited for their strategy. And that's outflank. So that is basically the reserve phase. So as I mentioned, there's 3 ways that a model can potentially come onto the battlefield from reserves. Number 1, walking on the board from the controlling player's table edge. Number 2, deep strike. That is probably the most common one. They can basically land wherever they want, and to do so, place them. They might scatter, they might mishap, but they might not. And finally 3, outflank. You roll a dice on a 1 or 2, left side of the table, 3 or 4, right side of the table, and 5 or 6, controlling player gets to choose. And that's it. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a comment in the comment section down below what you thought and anything else you want to add or any questions you might have about the reserve phase. If I missed anything, I'm very sorry, but together we will teach everyone about the reserve phase. So thank you very much for watching this episode of How to Play Warhammer 40K. I really hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next part where I'll be going over the movement phase. So until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting everyone.